Stay free with Russell Brand. See it first on Rumble.
Whitney, I've been watching some of your interviews, and I've got to say, like, it's one of those, the area of your research and expertise is one of those areas that's actually almost scary to talk about, because we on this show are continually talking about hypocrisy, corruption, the deep state, democracy being a kind of hollow and theatrical affair where real power is beyond the reach of ordinary people. We sort of infer sometimes that people may get assassinated because their interests and the stories that they tell are at odds with the agenda of powerful people. But how much proof you appear to have and your willingness to talk about it is somewhat staggering. So I guess there's to start with Jeffrey Epstein and his ties to incredibly powerful global figures, former President Bill Clinton and one of the world's most powerful tycoons, Bill Gates. Can you just sort of unpack for us the nature of these relationships, which have sort of, like, while people are peripherally aware of it, it seems to be something that's somehow been submerged and lost?
Sure. So if you look at the mainstream narrative about Epstein, no one in mainstream media wants to talk about Jeffrey Epstein and what he was doing before the year 2000. So if you look at the timeline with Epstein and Bill Clinton, for example, what you see is that from 1987 till roughly 1993, Jeffrey Epstein was one of the masterminds of one of the biggest Ponzi schemes in U.S. history. And, you know, financial criminality is consistent throughout his career. When that was being prosecuted, Jeffrey Epstein's name was dropped from the case in 1993. And that same year, he appears at Clinton fundraisers, some of the most controversial fundraisers of the entire Clinton administration. For example, in 1993, it was a fundraiser associated with the White House Historical Association being nominally run by the office of Hillary Clinton. It makes an appearance in Vince Foster's alleged suicide note, who was the White House counsel that died under very suspicious circumstances. And then Epstein was involved in, roughly after that, 15 visits to the White House in less than a 2-year span with a man named Mark Middleton, well, most of them were with Mark Middleton, who was a central figure in the 1996 campaign finance scandal, also known as Chinagate in some circles. And essentially there you have Epstein being involved in a massive way with those financial tricks, I guess you could say, for lack of a better word. And at the same time, he's involved in relocating Southern Air Transport, the CIA-linked airline involved in Iran-Contra, from its headquarters in Miami, Florida, to Ohio to ostensibly run cargo for Leslie Wexner's enterprises, where they'll be going from Columbus to Hong Kong, which interestingly enough was a major hub for a lot of this corruption in 1996 involving Mark Middleton, who Epstein's meeting with at the same time. Subsequently after this, which is the only time where mainstream media starts to talk about the Clinton-Epstein relationship, Clinton is out of office and setting up the Clinton Foundation. And a lot of the setup for the Clinton Foundation he is doing while flying on Jeffrey Epstein's plane, specifically the Africa trip, but also the Asia trip. And things out of this that come out of this are things like the Clinton Health Access Initiative, with later partners with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in very significant ways. So essentially what you have there is, considering that the Clinton Foundation's sort of been treated as a political slush fund of the Clinton family, you have Jeffrey Epstein over a period of decades being involved in essentially guiding the most suspect financial activity of the Clinton family from the early 90s onward, and including their rebranding of their, political cronyism as philanthropy. I'll pause before getting into Bill Gates, because that's a totally different story.
I mean, yeah, this is before we've got to Bill Gates. I mean, I didn't know that Epstein's skullduggery went all the way back to Iran-Contra. It seems like wherever there's corruption, Jeffrey Epstein was there, like a kind of Forrest Gump of global corruption. So is it then that even before you get to the salacious sexual rage, trafficking, abuse side of the Jeffrey Epstein story, there's mammoth financial corruption and the involvement of significant political and corporate figures?
Yeah, the financial criminality aspect of Epstein's career spans essentially from the late 70s all the way up until his second arrest in 2019. Whereas the crimes, as far as we know, span sometime between 1991 and up until his first arrest around 2006, 2007 or so, at least the bulk of those crimes that we know about.
And what is the nature of the connection with Bill Gates? Now that you've done the first Bill, let's move on to the second.
Right. So if you believe mainstream media, Bill Gates and Jeffrey Epstein didn't meet until 2011, but that is unfortunately for Bill Gates contradicted by evidence that's actually in mainstream media. So for example, the Evening Standard, a pretty mainstream outlet in the United Kingdom, has an article from, I believe, January 2001, where it's talking about Ghislaine Maxwell and her relationship with Prince Andrew, and discusses Jeffrey Epstein, introducing him to a UK audience. There it introduces him as a property developer and says that he made most of his millions through his business links to three individuals: Leslie Wexner, Donald Trump, and the third one is Bill Gates. So why would the Evening Standard name Bill Gates as one of the main business partners of Jeffrey Epstein during the 1990s if they didn't meet until roughly a decade later? No one in mainstream media has been interested in following that up with me, even though I've been contacted by outlets such as the BBC for that information, and then, never goes anywhere. And even beyond that, if you're looking at some other aspects of the Epstein-Gates relationship, you have a woman named Melanie Walker come along, who was allegedly recruited by Jeffrey Epstein to be a Victoria's Secret model in 1992. There's no evidence she ever modeled, but she became Epstein's science advisor in the late 90s, and shortly thereafter became science advisor to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. If you're Bill Gates and you're hiring a science advisor for your relatively new foundation, and you're looking at her CV, and all it really has is a science advisor to Jeffrey Epstein, you would have to know who Jeffrey Epstein is and what kind of science he was into. And this, again, is well before the 2011 date we're alleged to believe is when they first met. And I would argue that this isn't so much to protect Bill Gates, it's about protecting Microsoft, because Epstein in the 1990s, as well as the Maxwell family, extensively involved in the activities of Microsoft to a very significant, it's just very extreme. And Ghislaine Maxwell herself was involved in some of those business connections as well at a time when she was involved with Epstein. Epstein was also involved in a very suspicious trip, a delegation Microsoft sent to Russia in 1998, where he's touring local high schools in Russia with Microsoft executives. Some of those executives, like Nathan Myhrvold, later are allegedly tied to his trafficking operations and named by prominent Epstein victims as their abusers. And you also have Microsoft executives like Linda Stone also being in the mix there as well. So there's several executives. And Melanie Walker, who I just mentioned, ended up dating a top Microsoft executive in the early 2000s as well. Sorry.
Not at all, Whitney. The aspect of these crimes is, of course, independently heinous enough and exploitative in a manner that's almost difficult to conceive of in terms of its scale and scope and geographical reach and the number of people involved. But it appears that this is also merely one component, and in fact is an aspect of this is the use of this criminal activity in order to create ties that are connected to power. Am I correct? And where is it, Whitney, that all of this is going? Because it seems to me that you're handling a great deal of information and a great deal of energy, and that you have a sense yourself that you're very close to how global power really operates.
Well, that was my whole effort of the book. I wrote 1,000 pages. It's 2 volumes. The second volume focuses on Epstein, and the first volume focuses on how this happened and how this network that enabled Epstein essentially came into existence. And what I'm trying to do there is really just interrogate the power structures that are essentially running most of the Western world. And of course, the Western world, particularly U.S. empire, has client states around the world. In other words, this would be the power structure of most of the world today. And essentially what you have are major elements of organized crime and intelligence agencies, mainly in the U.S., U.K., and Israel, that essentially fused during, the World War II and the immediate post-World War era. And a lot of really crazy things have gone on. And essentially what I found is that history is littered with figures just like Jeffrey Epstein. He was not an anomaly at all, like we've been told by mainstream media. And thus, it's probably likely that people swimming in these elite circles for several decades, found this type of activity in which Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell were engaged to be perfectly normal. And actually, there's reports in 2003, and I think the Evening Standard and other UK outlets that openly talk about Ghislaine Maxwell training young blonde girls in techniques and brandishing whips at parties. People knew about this well before Epstein was arrested the first time, and nothing was done. And you even have the wife of the deceased Senator John McCain in the United States, Cindy McCain, saying in early January 2020, we all knew what he was doing, talking about Epstein. So this was known and nothing was done.
it's extraordinary. So it seems like it would be impossible to have a significant connection to Jeffrey Epstein and not know what he was doing. Overtly and explicitly, Jeffrey Epstein then is a realtor, a fixer, a global playboy. But the nature of his connections means what? That he's integrally involved in the true structures of power that are usually concealed from ordinary people.
Yeah, to an extent. I think he was really sort of a middle management figure who was sort of linking top tiers of this power structure and with, you know, people on the ground actually enacting a lot of these operations, policies and corrupt acts. And of course, him himself being intimately involved in several acts of corruption. As well. And ultimately, I think the reason the financial crimes are not discussed is because that's getting to the bottom of a lot of things that are still ongoing to this very day. And there's a lot of powerful interests that definitely don't want that coming out. And if you look at, for example, when efforts have been made to investigate the tie of Epstein and Wall Street banks, most recently with this situation in the Virgin Islands, the Attorney General was fired after trying to file suit against Deutsche Bank, I believe, for their relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. And the previous attempt to prosecute that in a U.S. court saw the judge's son assassinated, essentially, by someone that had previously worked for an intelligence-linked outfit called Kroll Associates. So there's a whole lot of crazy stuff there. And so why was I think it's pretty clear why the mainstream media won't touch this one if that's how it happened, that's how it's played out on the legal side.
I suppose we all have a sense that there are elite and inaccessible organizations that primarily are connected around the administration of power, the acquisition of profit, the manipulation of the media agenda, the top American political figures, significant corporate figures across the globe. Some of the world's most powerful billionaires have connections and relationships that are illicit. And of course, the nature of this story suggests that there is a component, that's a significant part of it. One of the other aspects of this is that I keep hearing people connected to this story die in mysterious circumstances. And then, of course, Jeffrey Epstein's death in custody doesn't seem to be entirely straightforward. What's your impression there, Whitney?
Of Epstein's death, I definitely think the official story is totally insane and very difficult to believe. And essentially, it's very hard to know what happened that day because the guards were asleep, the cameras didn't work, and all these different things, went wrong. And it's just a very difficult story to believe, especially if you believe the official story of how he allegedly hung himself after being on suicide watch with paper-thin sheets. And he's a tall guy. A lot of it doesn't really add up. And ultimately, if you look at other people in the Epstein case, for example, Mark Middleton, who I mentioned earlier, who was frequently meeting with Epstein at the White House around 94 and 1995, in May of last year, he was found hanging by the neck by an extension cord and a shotgun blast to the chest. A couple months after the Daily Mail published the visitor logs between him and Epstein and revealed that what was thought to be 5 visits was really closer to 17. And the local Arkansas court blocked all media and all files related to Middleton's death from being released, and it was ruled a suicide. So you tell me how likely it is that someone hung themselves and at the same time they shot themselves in the chest with a shotgun, and how likely that was actually a suicide as authorities maintain.
Occasionally these stories occur that reveal the true nature of power, and it makes me a bit scared, to tell you the truth, Whitney. Do you sometimes feel like, hold on a minute, if I keep talking about this stuff on the internet and write books about it, it's pretty clear that I'm in some risks. Do you ever feel that, mate?
So there's the network I trace in the book has been reported by previous journalists who had things happen to them, like Gary Webb and Danny Casolaro. But I think today the media, the powers that be are more likely to paint me as just a conspiracy theorist and ignore me than, go to all the effort of coming all the way to South America and executing some sort of hit or something like that. And ultimately, I feel that if you live in fear of these people, you're giving them power over you and power over your life. And if your goal is to free yourself and your family and ultimately the world from this type of corrupt power establishment, we should not be giving them power over us. So that's how I feel personally about it.
Stay free with Russell Brand. See it first on Rumble.